I know for a lot of the Canucks faithful that pay attention to this YouTube channel, you might be kind of ticked off with the amount of Oilers content that we've been making. But a lot of that has to do with my curiosity, because this team and the way they have proceeded from, of course, the start of McDavid's entire tenure to Peter Chiarelli to Ken Holland, the acquisitions, the goaltending, the playoffs, etc., etc., it's been very interesting to follow. Now, I'm not one to start saying that I'm an Oilers fan, but there are some elements to this team and its construction that I do think make noteworthy video topics, which is why we're talking about another player on this team yet again today. Let's talk about one of the absolute terrorizers of the Vancouver Canucks over the past 10 years. Actually, more like 13 years? Yeah, 13's a better number, I guess. Let's talk about Duncan Keith, because this is a guy whose situation heading into 2022-2023 is so interesting, and there could be so many underlying ramifications towards this entire situation that make everything a lot more unnecessarily complicated, in my opinion. So, Duncan Keith, as we said, was a pretty big antagonist for the Vancouver Canucks since the early 2010s. The whole Daniel Sedin thing made things a lot worse, plus the fact that he was on a Chicago team that was so dominant in the playoffs, it really made it easy to hate this guy, especially for myself as a Vancouver Canucks fan. Those sorts of sentiments were always sort of there. But Duncan Keith, as we said, he's 38 years old now. He's making $5.538 million till the end of the 2023 season. This is important because he's got 1 year left on that contract. Now, the contract was huge. He signed it back in 2010. It started in 2010-2011, and it's ending now. But during this entire time with Duncan Keith having a no-move clause, etc., etc., he's been a pretty capable NHL player. He maxed out with 69 points in 82 games in 2009-2010, and he had a 61-point campaign in 79 games in 2013-14. He won the Conn Smythe in 2015, getting 21 points in 23 games in that season's playoffs, where they actually beat the Tampa Bay Lightning. We'll see if the Colorado Avalanche can follow up in that respect in this year's Stanley Cup final. But for Duncan Keith, towards the end of his Chicago days, things were a lot more unstable than you would have liked. This is because of the Chicago Blackhawks and their rebuild, the entire conversation talking about Patrick Kane, whether or not Jonathan Toews would ever be on the block. Now you have Kirby Dach and Alex DeBrincat and all these other guys that are supposedly available to being traded now, but that's another story for another day. Duncan Keith, though, in his last season in Chicago had 15 points in 54 games played. He then got traded over to the Oilers, where in 64 games he put up 21 points. Now, the trade to Edmonton was a really interesting move because you saw the Blackhawks end up getting Caleb Jones in that move. They also got Seth Jones earlier on. They made the trade for the brothers over there, and they sent Duncan Keith over to an Oilers squad that was interested in the leadership and the veteran presence that he provided. Now, sure, he didn't produce the lights out. 21 points is not amazing, but it's still good enough to say that he's an NHL caliber defenseman. In the postseason for the Oilers, he had 5 points in 16 games, which is, it's not great, and it gets even worse when you acknowledge that 3 of those points came in one game against the Calgary Flames. So Duncan Keith definitely wasn't the Conn Smythe winner he was in 2015 in this year's postseason. Of course, the fact that he's 38 probably has something to do with it. He was 30 when he had that Conn Smythe year all those years ago. But now, with Keith in a position with 1 year left, there is a bigger conversation that has opened up as to whether or not the 38-year-old will retire. This is why it's such a big deal, as highlighted on Puckpedia. Here's an interesting aspect with Duncan Keith if he is traded and he retires after this 2021-2022 season. The Blackhawks would have $7.5 million of a recapture cap hit allocated as $5.5 million in 2022-2023 and $2 million in 2023-2024. The new team has a cap benefit/savings of $3.4 million in 2022-2023. Now, what that means in a nutshell is that if Duncan Keith retires today, the Blackhawks would get a cap penalty and the Oilers would get cap savings. If Duncan Keith retired this summer, his 5.5 cap hit would be removed for the Oilers and they would get a 3.4 recapture cap credit, which means there's extra cap space given to them. The Blackhawks would have a $7.5 million recapture cap hit, allocated as $5.5 in 2022-2023 and $2 million in 2023-24. We just said that same thing. Here's the explanation as to why that works. Seriously, Keith has a cap hit of 5.5. Why would the Oilers get a $3.4 million extra cap space credit? It doesn't make sense. They paid him $2.1 million this season, but his cap hit was 5.5, Puckpedia says. The opposite of a cap benefit that the rule is intended to recapture. So the Oilers' cap would be $3.4 million more than all the other teams, and Chicago would be $3.4 million less. Okay, that's not accurate, the last part. It's $5.5 million for the cap hit, and then an extra $2 million, I believe, just for the penalty. So Chicago is in a really interesting spot should Duncan Keith go out there and say, hey, I'm going to retire now. They would have $5.5 million taken up this season and $2 million the next. So if Duncan Keith really wanted to screw over Chicago, he could just say, yeah, I'm going to retire right now. Here you go, Oilers, $5.5 million in cap space from my cap hit, and an extra $3.4 million as well from the cap credit, giving you an extra $9 million in cap space. If Duncan Keith retires, the Oilers could have a field day with re-signing Evander Kane, getting what other goaltender is on the market that they could sign, and just trying to improve their team overall. Now, I get it, losing out on Duncan Keith might actually remove some value from your team as well, but as we said, the guy only had 2 points in the entire postseason if you remove one game against Calgary, and sure, he looked great in that one game, but it's no secret that Duncan Keith is not the same player that he was in 2015. And it's kind of funny seeing where a lot of Oilers fans are going with this conversation. Here's the first comment on Reddit from, oh boy, CESJZJFF. Okay, I'm not going to try to pronounce that. If I'm Ken Holland, I'm offering him a bogus front office position for a pile of money and begging him to retire. Special consultant to defense. Let him mentor Boucher and Keith. I mean, Broberg, I'm dumb. Let him get paid, get us some cap relief. Which is fair. You could totally understand why a lot of fans would be like, yeah, why the hell are we not gonna just force this guy to retire? We can get $9 million in cap space from that. That is crazy. But then we had Bob Stouffer on Oilers Now who said this. Further to Bob Stouffer's point, Puckpedia is also hearing that the NHL's current position is that teams should not receive cap recapture credit or benefits, even though those calculations are outlined in 13 CBA section 50.5 DII. There likely would be a discussion between the team and the NHL if Duncan Keith did retire. And so even though the rule is that Duncan Keith retiring should give the Oilers $5.5 million for the Keith cap hit as well as an extra $3.4 million and the difference in the actual money they paid for him, there would be the NHL coming in here and saying, okay, wait, hold your horses here. Is that really something that we can allow you to do? Not because it's against the rules, but because the NHL apparently doesn't feel like the rules are fair. So, yeah, it's kind of wacky that this is coming in right as the conversation is picking up. Here is another tweet from Puckpedia. If Duncan Keith retired and the cap credit was not provided, this raises other questions. Firstly, is the Blackhawks recapture cap hit reduced by the $3.4 million? If not, then the league-wide recapture hit is $3.4 million greater than it should be, reducing league-wide cap space by $3.4 million than in the CBA. Secondly, when Roberto Luongo retired, the Canucks appealed their recapture cap hit, but were told those are the rules in the CBA and nothing can be done. What changed? The only recapture change is a 20 CBA MOU that the recapture cap hit in a year is limited to the player's original cap hit. And so the NHL has always had such a problem with consistency when it comes to refereeing, offsides, discipline, suspensions, and all that stuff, and I mean, apparently, the cap recapture stuff might fall under that same boat. The Vancouver Canucks tried to appeal their recapture cap hit with Luongo, and the NHL said no. So why is it different now when there hasn't even been a Duncan Keith retirement situation yet? At the time of recording this audio, he is still a part of the Oilers roster, and he's apparently going to play. We don't know if that's going to stay true over the next few weeks, though. We'll just say that. And the NHL is already saying, hey, if Duncan Keith retires, we're going to have to step in. We're going to have to say no. We're going to have to say, maybe you cannot do that. I'm not too sure, Edmonton. Sorry. Like, something's got to give here, man. Something's got to give. Talk in the comments if you're an Oilers fan. What do you want your team to do with Keith? Force this guy to retire and get $9 million in cap space? Or would you rather not go through the struggle because who knows if you're even going to be able to get that cap credit in the first place if the NHL steps in and says no? Talk in the comments all your thoughts about this idea. I hope you enjoyed this British Trolls 99. And Bye.